My name is Brent Mai, and I know that most of you think that I look like I'm Asian, but I'm actually not. I'm Volga German. Mai is the German month of May, so that's why we get to be German, although my cousin's call sign as an F-16 fighter pilot was Mai Tai. So anyway, we have that going for us as well. But it's my honor to be here with you on the anniversary of the chapter here. I haven't been around quite as long as Larry has, but he and I actually served on the board at the same time for a while on the international board. Seems like 100 years ago. And got to know a number of people here in Fresno. Was down here years and years ago. Got to meet with Diana at the firehouse and see the museum and the wonderful things that you've done here to lead the effort. I mean, you're the one and only chapter that has this sort of a foundational set of documents and a building and people who are dedicated and work there, and you're open 5 days a week, which is just way more than any place else at this point in the country, and just amazing. So thank you to yourselves for putting that together and keeping it going. When I talk to people around the world, believe it or not, they're not all over 70, you know? They actually aren't. There is interest out there, and people, my children think it's kind of fascinating to be Volga Germans, and that's a unique part of the history of our world, and they play a unique part in the history of the world, and they love to hear me talk about that sort of thing. So anyway, thank you very much. Currently, I live in Jacksonville, Florida, which is the northeastern corner of Florida on the Atlantic Ocean, so the other side of the country from here. I have a daughter that's at UCSD in La Jolla, and she lives at the other end of I-10. So we live on opposite ends of I-10 in this country. But it's fascinating world that we have between those two shores, and that's what we want to talk about today. Fresno is much bigger than just Fresno or Fresno County or even the Central Valley of California. The impact of the people here has been felt around the country, and we'll see a little bit of that. I have a very relatively short presentation, I think, put together, despite the fact that he wouldn't let me talk for 3 hours, which was my original request. But what I would like to do is to take this conversation in the direction that you want it to go. So questions that you have and things that you would like to talk about, that's what I want to talk about as well. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information here about the Volga Germans of Fresno. The first thing that you should know is that Fresno came about with Volga Germans that came from all over the place. 95% of Volga Germans are actually ethnically German, but there are 5% of them that are something else. My apologies to the back of the room, because this slide has a lot of stuff on it that's very small. For the surnames that we have been able to research, we know they came from these towns in Germany, and 3 of the places that are on this list are actually not in Germany at all. We have a family here that's actually traces its heritage back to Stockholm in Sweden, another one that traces its ancestry back to Copenhagen in Denmark, and another one that traces its history back to a Polish, what today is a Polish village that used to be in German Prussia. So today you'll find that part of the world. This map over here on the right-hand side is from the website of the Volga German Institute, which is at the University of North Florida. And each one of those green dots, if you're on the website, you can actually click through to the village that's represented by the dot there. So what I study are the socioeconomic movement patterns of Volga Germans. To simplify that, that's why did we go where we went? And why are we where we are today? Okay? So it's not only where we went, but why we went there. And that's why you'll find all sorts of interactive maps on this website, maps from Germany, maps from Russia, and then maps from the diaspora of the Volga Germans as they scattered around the world. So this one, I just pulled the surnames from Fresno that we've been able to track back to a particular village in Germany or Sweden or Copenhagen or Poland, and put them up there. So you can see that you in this room come from a lot of different places, mostly, however, over here in southwestern Germany. So that's near Heidelberg, in Hessen and the Palatinate in the Pfalz region. So that's where most of those people are from. But you'll find a few that are coming from areas that are up here in the north part of Germany as well, in what today is Schleswig-Holstein. All right? So that's just way too small for people. This doesn't get very much better. So I know that we celebrate in general here, the original folks that came to Fresno came from 9, I think, colonies on the Volga. The 9 that are right here in this string. But people live in Fresno today from all of these other colonies as well. So here there are a list of them. I think there are about 50 of the colonies that are represented by people who live in Fresno today. So it's more than just the 9. Fresno is a melting pot of Volga Germans too. All right? Frank. Where are we going? Frank is up here, the top one. Right there. All right? So there are so many Volga Germans in Fresno. I know of 250 surnames, Volga German surnames in Fresno. If your name isn't on this one and the next slide, because there were so many, with the exception of the Olbergs, and my apologies, I forgot about the Olbergs. How could I do this? I mean, sausage is the name of my game, and I forgot them on here. So add them to the next slide. But anyway, this is A through Ganshorn. So these are, and be a little creative with your spellings. Okay, so if we don't see your spelling up here, that might be because it's morphed over time. But anyway, this is just a part of the Volga Germans who live in Fresno, and many of you have more than 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 of these surnames in your families. So this is the second group. Oh, we didn't get the Olbergs there on the next slide. Anyway, all of these families are Volga German families. Okay, and we do end up with interesting combinations of things too. Like, for example, we have the Kerbers and the Kerners. So you have all these that are just together. The Metzgers, and on the next slide is the Metzlers. So you've got families that are very close together, but they're different ones. The Grosses and the Grosses are 2 separate sets of people. This is the last slide of names that I know of. Now, if you have figured out your names aren't up there or something is missing, you let me know, because I'll fix it, okay? All right. On the last slide is my email. Everything, contact me. You can always reach me through Jim or through someone else if you need to. But anyway, so my point in putting all this kind of just information up there is that Fresno, by my calculation, I guess, is the second largest Volga German community in the country. The largest one is in Chicago. There are 12 different neighborhoods of Volga Germans in Chicago. And so they have the largest number of people there today. Fresno is the second largest concentration of Volga Germans. Now, this doesn't count Kansas as a whole or Nebraska as a whole, but for cities, Fresno is one of those that is the most well represented. Portland, it's the third one. And following that come in Lincoln and Denver. So you guys are leaders in a lot of different ways, but you have more people here than just the original people that came. People have continued to move to Fresno looking for work and looking for relatives to join as well. So where did they come from? This is just a little tiny example. Many of you have seen these sorts of things before. These are 4 of the churches from the colonies that we have. Straub over here on the left. The top in the middle is Kukas. Lower in the center is Stahl. And in the top right is the church in Jost. And the years that the churches were constructed. We're still having a little bit of debate about when the church in Kukas was actually finished. So if anybody wants to weigh in on that, I'm happy to hear what your conclusion is. built in the 1860s. All four of these are in generically what we call the contour style. The contora was the governing agency from the czars that basically coordinated all the activities of the colonies on the Volga. It was called the contora. And the contora hired an architect in the 1830s to design a blueprint for the congregations, for the churches on the Volga. And so most of the churches over time built these contora style churches. So they have a front porch with some pillars, a really tall steeple, and even though the inside of the church may just be long and narrow, from the rooftop usually it was in the form of a cross. So that was another one of the features of those. And believe it or not, here Kukas has a really good example. You can see the bell tower here is in front of the church because they didn't put the bells in the steeples in Russia. They built a separate bell tower. So whole number of reasons for that. But anyway, so this is where they came from. I have a couple of pictures of some street scenes. This is the church in Warrenburg, and also a street scene with the church in Warrenburg at the end. This one, and oh my gosh, I was going to look it up. I've messed up in my mind. You guys that were there, we went to the church in Warrenburg. The ruins of this church are still there. But it was either in Laub or Straub, where there's also, the church is still there, and it's actually being used as a community center. In Russian, it's called a Dom Kultura, so the house of culture, but it's where they have community activities. So that building is still standing. The rest of the ones that are from the colonies that most of you are connected to no longer exist. The buildings were taken down mostly in the 1930s, and the materials used for other buildings in town. But the church in Warrenburg still stands today. It's a shell. So, and this street, though, that leads straight up to the church is not there anymore. The street that leads to the church is over a block now from where that is. All right. This next one is a street scene from Laue. And this happens to be from the 1930s, but it would have looked no different when your ancestors would have left the colonies back in the day. An interesting thing I like to point out about these churches, you'll notice that there are no doors on the street side of the houses. The doors are on the courtyard side of the house, and so you would go through the gate here, or there's a little gate as well. You can see each one of these has a gate between the houses, and you would go into the back side of the house and come into the house through the courtyard behind the house. And on the street side, you just had long, generally wide streets like this, and you could sit out there in front. So you've got a great little group of men here chatting away the day, and a dog. All right. So now we're moving from Russia to Fresno. Now this is an old picture. I would imagine here somebody there in this museum, there are older pictures than this that you could find, but this was one that was relatively close to when the Volga Germans came here to Fresno from 1882. This is a look, and this is St. Joseph's Catholic Church, which isn't there anymore. The current St. Joseph's, I think, is in Selma, something. But this was a view of downtown Fresno. This is a little different. And then this is the train station where the first group of Volga Germans arrived. Now, unlike the other, Volga Germans started arriving in the United States in 1875. So this is now 12 years later. But unlike most of the West Coast, which was already being populated by Volga Germans in Oregon and Washington by this time, the groups that came to Fresno came directly here. They didn't stop they came by train, so of course they stopped along the way too, but they didn't stop for years in Kansas or Nebraska, which most of them had done. Instead, they were coming directly here, directly recruited to come to the Central Valley of California and live here. So here you've got 8 families. I think this comes from something you did, Diana did years ago. where I got this information, where they came, the first group arriving on the 19th of June in 87, and then a couple of groups following shortly thereafter that brought other families. So you can see we get a very small group here that eventually becomes, today, 250 at a minimum, 250 families, surnames, so whole families that are here. And we start with just this little group of barely over 20 families that come here. So that's the depot that as it existed then. Does it exist today? I don't know. Is it part of some historical preservation? They've renovated it? Yeah. I heard the train this morning when I woke up. So this is a cool little description, though. I love to look at the contemporary descriptions of what other people think is happening in town. Okay, my favorite. So those of you who think that the media is not has never been political until today, wrong. Okay, the first Volga Germans in the United States that came in large numbers arrived in Topeka, Kansas, and at the time there were 6 newspapers in Topeka, and how the 6 newspapers covered the arrival of those people is fascinating. All the way from, oh my gosh, these guys are bringing, pestilence and disease from some foreign country, to the other end of the spectrum is these are going to be the hard industrious workers of the future of our city. So this is a description from the Fresno Republican on the 24th of June. On Monday, I'll read this so those in the back can see. On Monday, 8 men and women and 7 children, immigrants from a German colony in Russia, arrived at Fresno having come for the purpose of securing occupations as farm laborers. And, like most people from the old country, the intention of securing land of their own in this country where land is yet so plentiful and so cheap. So already these guys had identified these guys are going to come and they're going to work for us for now, but they're going to be the ones that are actually owning the land here in the future. Okay? German peasants, fresh from the fields of their nativity, are not often seen here. Okay? And the odd dress of both the men and the women has attracted a good deal of attention when seen on the streets. Can you imagine if you saw this coming down the street in June, no doubt? Okay? So bright colors predominate the costume of both sexes, and all of them appear to be quite clean and tidy. Although there is not much style in their clothes. Okay, so we've already got a commentary on Volga German haute couture here. Okay? All of the men but one are farmers, and he's a carpenter. They're apparently sober and industrious people, and are likely to find plenty of work if they are quick to learn the manners and customs of our country. So I think that's a pretty good description. At least it's a positive one, as opposed to a couple of the papers in Topeka that thought we were bringing, disease and pestilence upon their communities. So anyway, and this is a very typical Volga German costume of that particular time period. So you'll notice that for example, the mural that we have downstairs, they're depicted a little bit later during the Soviet era, where you had a little more Russian influence. So, for example, this is more of a Volga German hat than the sort of military flat hat that's in the mural downstairs. Okay, this is another picture from Fresno, not too far from the time when they arrived here. This is looking northwest on J Street, which is evidently now Fulton. Again, downtown Fresno, woohoo. No traffic lights. Pretty good. All right. So this is the center, the 4-block sort of hub of the Volga German community that was in downtown Fresno in Russiantown. All right. You can see all of the blocks are marked. This comes from an architectural resources study that was done a number of years ago. The original cross church is over there that was built in 1895. This was done, oh my goodness, I forget when it was, in the 70s or something. No, this was before the freeway, so it would have had to have been before 48. Anyway, Cross Church used to be located here. Okay, this is the old Cross Church, which actually used to be down farther down here and had been moved to there once they built the new one. They brought the old one with them and moved it up there. That building is no longer there, of course. And in 1948, is it? They moved the Cross Church from the corner of San Diego and F down to the corner of E in Los Angeles. Okay? Now some of you got to see this thing. Larry was talking about, he was here and got to watch this. Anybody else who got to witness the church driving down the street? That took quite a while for this to actually happen. I don't know, you said something like 2 inches in an hour or something. It was very slow. Larry was very young at the time, so, watching this thing go. Anyway, so it was moved in 1948 and is now the Fresno Temple Church of God that's still located there. Now, why did this whole thing happen? The freeways. So, here is where that little 4-block area is today. So it actually wasn't 99 that blew through the middle of the neighborhood. It was 41 that went through where Cross Church is where it used to be where the star is. Now it's over where the red Fresno Temple Church of God little symbol is there. And then I-99 blew through the south side of that area, the southwest side of that. So now it's being not from Fresno and trying to find this place was quite entertaining because most of the roads in that area don't actually go through anywhere. You can only get into that little triangle of the area by hit and miss trying to get there. So anyway, it's an interesting little corner of the world. Now, lest you think this was the only Volga German neighborhood that got blown away like this by the freeways. Okay, the same thing happened in Denver, and the same thing happened in Portland to the Volga German neighborhood. Going up I-5 through Portland blew right through the middle of the Volga German neighborhood and took out a 3-block swatch going north and south, straight through the middle of the neighborhood. In Denver, it was even worse because both I-70 and I-25 went through the Volga German neighborhood, so it created 4 quadrants of that old neighborhood, and consequently everybody, similar to here, left that area of town. Portland was the same way. So one of the discussions we had at our table here during lunch was that it's not just the ethnic group makeup, but it's the fact that these people were the poor people in town and had very little political clout in order to fight something like this if you wanted to preserve your neighborhood. I think a big different thing that happened here in Fresno is that the community was able to save that church, which would have been right in the middle of the northbound lanes of 41, okay? And they were able to preserve it by moving it out of the area. Now that didn't preserve the community for very long after that, but nevertheless it was they made an attempt to preserve their neighborhood by moving one of the central cultural focal points of the community to a new location. So I think that's kind of cool. We don't see that happening in lots of other Volga German neighborhoods around the country. So these are just a couple of the houses from the Volga German neighborhoods. Frederick Bopp over here on the left and Pastor Legler on the right. Just very typical structures for Fresno architecture. Yeah, still some of those houses around. Many of them were built by Volga German carpenters as well. Okay, and Fresno hasn't sat still. The way I started this was talking to you about how big the Fresno community is. You can see down in the far right-hand corner, Fresno Volga Germans now live in lots of other parts of the Central Valley here, some in Fresno County and the neighboring areas. Over time, this is our extrapolation, and I think that 250,000 is probably pretty conservative for the number of people in this town that have some part of their heritage being Volga German. So I would say perhaps unlike our neighbors over here on the back wall, the Armenians, who do a huge amount of work and effort at keeping the fact that they have an Armenian neighborhood in Fresno forefront of what everybody thinks of. I mean, when I told people in Jacksonville I was coming to Fresno, they said, oh, there's a big Armenian population there. Why did the people in Jacksonville know that? Okay. Well, it's because the Armenians in Fresno want people to know that. So if you want people to know that you're here in this town, you got to say something about it. So that's why I go around yakking around the world about Volga Germans. But today, you could have 250,000 out of 1.5 million. What's the population here in the metro area? That's not an insignificant number of people that you have in your community here who share a history in common with you. So I think that's pretty cool. Anyway, there are undoubtedly people here who know way more about Fresno and being Volga German in Fresno than I do. I encourage you to talk to me more about things like that. On the Volga German website, there's a page for Fresno. Off of the Fresno page are linked every family that I've identified as being in Fresno has a page of its own that talks about that family, how they got to Russia, where they came from in Germany. And then at the bottom of that page are also links to everywhere that family went. Not only Fresno, but other communities in North America. And we also have 1.5 million Volga Germans that live in Argentina. About 400,000 live in Brazil as well. Anybody here think they have relatives in Argentina? All of you have relatives in Argentina, okay? Because they went there at the same time, just like we all have relatives who got lost and ended up in South America. So it's a matter of perspective on how you look at the world for whether you fall on one side or the other. But all of the villages that were on that page of about 50 that are represented here in Fresno are also represented in Argentina. So you will find you've got some relatives there too. By the way, I tried desperately to make the Pope be Volga German. Okay? No, he's Italian, just through and through. Anyway, the current Pope is from Argentina, by the way. So I tried to make him Volga German because lots of Volga Germans in Argentina are Catholic. I thought we had a good shot, but didn't work. Anyway, I want to answer your questions that you have about Volga German history, about immigration to the Central Valley, immigration to the United States. What kind of questions do you have that are burning in your bank of knowledge that you want to know about? And you can look up things on the website as well. Poke around on your own. Send me questions. I love questions from places. I got one this morning. Anybody here from Schwede? You take your ancestors comes from Schwede. I've got a German lady looking for someone to help her acquire records from the colony of Schwede. So I said I would ask this group. I didn't know this was a very Swedish group. But anyway, there are Volga German. There were so many Swedish Volga Germans that there's actually a colony called Schwede, which means Swedish in German. There are so many French Volga Germans. There's a colony called Franzosen. Okay, so not all the original Volga Germans were German. The Germans just kind of took over all those other colonies in the area, and so they're all Volga German. Anybody here know what a Pleve chart is? A chart that was done by Dr. Pleve and his students in Saratov. The very first one of those that I ever saw was a lady. Pleve came to the conference in Seattle one year, the first conference that he came to. And at that point, that was 92 maybe, 91, something like that. So the Soviet Union had just fallen apart, and he still was bringing these things by hand over to the United States. And then you went up to his hotel room in the hotel at the SeaTac airport area, and then you paid for your chart in person with cash, and he handed you your chart. And the very first one of these I saw was a lady came down the elevator and popped out into the lobby, and I was standing there. And his original charts were all done in Russian. So this is a lady from Chicago, had absolutely no idea what was on this chart. Okay? It's all in Russian. She comes running over to me and she opens up this chart and she says, "What does it say? What does it say?" And I told her, I said, "It says you're Swedish." because the top person on the chart was someone who had been born in Sweden, not in Germany at all. So anyway, she about fell over on the floor at that point. But anyway, so you never know what you're going to find out. The DNA thing is absolutely fascinating as we're learning more and more about Volga Germans and what that means. And believe it or not, if you happen to be 100% Volga German and your DNA comes back and says you're English, you're actually not. It's the English who are Germans. So anyway, just some interesting things about the way the DNA lines have been identified, or been tagged, I guess I should say, by researchers. And they're getting better and better all the time. Yeah. It's just if you've nowadays when you do who are the guys who won the kits, you're going to get to see all this stuff. You register there. Now they actually will send you updates, and they'll say, "Oh, we've changed your background." Well, that's being changed based on the numbers of people who have turned in, who have participated in the studies, but also along with those studies, you need to turn in a little bit of genealogical data with that, and so that they're able to match your gene with a particular set of other people who have genes who say they're coming from the same place, and then that particular strand of genes, I'm using all the wrong words here for my medical people, but anyway, is then tagged as a German line, or tagged as a Swedish line, or tagged as a something else. So in recent updates, a lot of people have been identified as being Russian. Well, you're not actually Russian, but your family lived in Russia, and if that's as far back as you can go, and you don't really identify that they actually came before that from Germany, the folks that are working with the big sets of this data are tagging some of these new lines as being Russian just because they actually came from Russia, and from the middle of Russia, where you don't expect to have other gene groups in there. And it's going to correct itself over time, as more data is gathered and more data is analyzed a little better from that standpoint. And that's why you find that you keep getting an update as more people are participating. And the other thing that's happening as well is more folks from around the world are participating. The reason we all came out being English in the beginning was because most of the ones who have been doing this were actually English people from England. And those gene strains had been tagged as English because they didn't go back another generation and found out, that our dear old queen in England is actually almost 100% German, so when you look at it that way. But anyway, so the DNA thing is a fun thing. I would use it more as an entertaining sort of thing, and ways to have nice conversations with your neighbors and things like that, rather than making it, some definitive statement that I am therefore this because my gene test said so, so but it's getting better as more people do that. The one thing I probably could say is that we're probably all Viking. They got around. So anyway, somewhere. Larry.
Considering the high concentration of Volga Germans in various areas of the United States, how is it that the Institute is ended up in Florida?
Why is the Institute for Volga German Studies in Florida? Do you want me to answer that question? It's because that's where I am. It sort of follows me around. So it was in Connecticut for 3 years before that. And who was in Connecticut 3 years before that? Anyway, I was at Fairfield University in Connecticut before I went to Florida. The Center for Volga German Studies was founded in Portland years ago, shortly after I got to Portland, and that was a group effort. For those of you who are familiar with that center, it no longer exists because the college that it was attached to no longer exists. And I took with it when I moved to Fairfield before the college collapsed. Moved to Fairfield, it made sense that the website that we were operating there moved with me. So that's where the Volga German Institute came from. We couldn't be the Center for Volga German Studies because I didn't bring the stuff like the library you have here. I didn't take material stuff with me. That needed to stay in the Northwest, I thought. It made no sense to have a big collection of Volga German stuff in Connecticut. That just was not logical. So we left the collection there. Since then, it's been distributed in a variety of different places. But anyway, so the website came with me. The website then moved with me also to Florida as well. And I hope that you take advantage of it. We have roughly 35,000 page views every month. There, give or take, about 3,200 unique users of the website every month. So it's not an insignificant research tool for those of you. It is a place to start looking into your history and culture of your family. It is not the end all for everything. You'll find on the pages that are there, you'll find source lists that point you to other resources that will give you more information about whatever it is you're clicking on, whether it's one of the villages in Germany or Russia or one of the family names and where all of that information came from. It also identifies people who have contributed information to that page, so you can go and talk to them directly about more stuff that they have available on that family. What's been amazing to me is that we've been able to, since 1990, since the archives in Russia were opened, we've been able to track, just as an example, all of those families on that very first slide that I showed, all those towns in Germany where people from Fresno can trace their history. I never would have believed that would have been possible. When I grew up, my grandparents told me all of the information in Russia had been destroyed, and we would never know any of this stuff. So the fact that we're able to find out this kind of detail is just fascinating, just amazing. And a number of researchers, one of my main researchers for identifying where Volga Germans have come from is actually in Argentina. And she's never left Argentina. She does all of her work down there at identifying places in Germany where families came from. Not just hers, but lots of families, you know. And she identifies one family in a village, and then she's kind of like, aha, it's very unlikely they were the only family from this village. And she goes through there and finds other families that are also from that particular village in Germany, and then went to Russia. I do a lot of the assistance at finding out which villages in Russia they came from. She doesn't do Russian. So that's a helpful part that I can add to that work. But it's other people's work as well. So that's one of the big things I think about the Volga German Institute. It's designed to be I've lost the word, a gathering place for information from all sorts of different sources that are out there. English, German, Russian, Spanish, Portuguese, French. Okay, that's where Volga Germans live today, in countries that speak those languages. Give you one little interesting little thing that doesn't impact Fresno terribly much. We have Volga German colonies in Australia. Okay, in 1921, during the famine, a lot of folks left the Volga region and went toward Western Europe in search of food. The people in one colony, Schaffhausen, the northernmost colony on the Wiesenseite, which is the east side of the river, the northernmost colony, they actually went the other way. They went toward Siberia. It's like, so these guys weren't really very bright. But anyway, they went toward Siberia. And eventually, by the end of the 1930s, had ended up in China. Well, then when Mao did all of his stuff, they got booted out of there and as a whole relocated to Australia. So you have Volga German families in Australia that are sort of native, original immigrants to Australia. I'm sure you may have relatives who've moved to Australia too. I do too. But these are Volga Germans who sort of went from Russia and ended up there. We have Volga Germans in South Africa. Same thing. They were recruited to settle in South Africa. Okay, so the one thing that's sort of in common among North America, Canada, the United States, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, and Australia is they went to parts of the country that are flat and don't have any trees. Sort of like Fresno too, I guess, now that you think about it. Not quite as deserty as here. But historically, they went to areas that looked like where they were leaving in Russia. So just kind of similar sorts of things. Question in the back, sorry. Did they send scouts to Fresno? I don't know that they did. Have you ever heard that? I'm looking at Diana here. She's kind of knows way more about that. I don't believe so. There were two sets of scouts that were sent from. We'll back up a little bit for why they left Russia in the first place. In 1870, the Russian government passed what in Russian is called an ukaz, an edict, a decree, that the end of the freedom of military conscription it was the Universal Conscription Act. Anyway, so all Russians had to serve in the military. So that rule, that obliterated the promise that had been made by Catherine the Great that the Volga Germans would never, or their descendants would never have to serve in the military. So that act took effect in 1874. Okay? So in 1874, the first people out of Russia were the Mennonites. They weren't having any of this military stuff. So they came over here first. It took the Lutherans and the Catholics a little bit longer to get their act together, so the first of them came in 75, followed by larger numbers in 76 through 78. Okay, so they came in mass groups. But in 74, okay, the first lottery for military conscription happened in October of 1874, and the first groups came over here in the summer. These scout groups came here, and a group went to South America at the same time. Okay, so there were two scout groups that came to Kansas and Nebraska primarily. They spent a little bit of time in Missouri, but pretty much quickly determined there were too many trees and they didn't know how to handle that. So they went to Nebraska and Kansas, and down in Argentina, they went out to the western parts, and then north of Buenos Aires in Entre Rios province, where it was also just wide open steppe kind of country. The group but while they were here in the United States anyway, they actually met with representatives primarily from the railroads. So the railroads then, caught wind, okay, because what did the railroad have in the prairie states anyway in 1874? They had lots of land, because that's how the government was funding the construction of the railroads. They gave every other section in huge swaths of the prairie area, every other section was given to the railroads so that they could raise money to fund the building of the railroads. Okay? But the railroads have land, they need people on the land. So then they started sending agents back to Russia to recruit people who were wanting to come to the prairies. Okay? So the early Volga Germans who came to the United States, the Mennonites included, actually bought property. They weren't doing part of the Homestead Act thing, the very first groups that came. The second and third and fourth waves ended up having to go farther out in Nebraska, farther out in Kansas, getting into eastern Colorado, where there was still homestead land available, and they bought properties out there. But they bought land, huge amounts of land. I have a whole presentation on that whole movement that talks about numbers, and I've lost track of the exact numbers in my head. But in today's dollars, millions and millions of dollars was spent buying land from the railroads back in those days. So the farmers here in the Central Valley caught wind that there were people, this was a particular group moving. I'm going to guess that they did similar things to some of these other ethnic groups that you see in this museum, but the Volga Germans were recruited to come directly here, to be farmers. That's what they were recruited here to do. That's a lot of the story of how people got where they were going at that time period, was because they were recruited. There were whole page advertisements in the Volga German newspapers talking about the land of milk and honey, okay, in German words. The land of milk and honey, which at that point was Kansas and Nebraska. Ha, ha, ha. So I'm from Kansas, I can say that. So anyway, they were coming over here in large numbers, large ethnic groups. The Volga Germans weren't the only ones that the railroads were after. They went after Bukovinans, so people from the southern parts of what today would be the Slovak countries. Germans from Germany directly. They went after Swedes. They went after the Irish. They went after all sorts of different farming culture people to get them to move out to the middle of nowhere, which is what the prairies of Kansas, Nebraska, eastern Colorado were at that time. They weren't moving into Oklahoma yet then. That came after 1900. And they just kept going west. But already by 1890, they first arrived in Kansas and Nebraska in 75, the non-Mennonite groups in 1875. By 1881, they were already in Oregon. 1882, they were already in Washington. 1887, they were already in California. So they were moving fast across the country, finding places to go. And they kept in touch with each other. That's what I think is fascinating too. My guess is your family has letters from the old country probably, that are just amazing that they kept in touch with these people. And they brought them their relatives. They sponsored relatives to come over. So none of them came over illegally. They all followed the rules of the day. All right. And believe it or not, there were almost zero stowaways. That's a good story we all like to have. But if there were as many stowaways on as people in the United States claim, Grandpa was a stowaway on a ship, there wouldn't have been any paying passengers. So, back then they kept track of everything, just like we do now. You had to be on the list that got on the boat in order to get off the boat, So those were very, very few and far between. But anyway, this group that came to Fresno came directly here by train, all the way across the country. So interestingly, the group from that settled in Oregon, that first settled in Oregon in 1881, came by train to San Francisco and then took the ships up to Portland from San Francisco, because the train actually stopped at that point, still stopped somewhere in Utah that was headed toward the northwest. So that Oregon group actually was in California for probably a few weeks anyway. So other kinds of questions. I don't want to keep you here all day. Well, I really do, but I can't. So how did they pay for getting over here? The early ones, you sold what you had in Russia. You could sell things and buy a ticket. When you bought a ticket to the United States, working through one of the, I'll call them travel agencies. That's a pretty modern terminology for that. But there was a place, there were groups that would go where you could put this all together. So when you left Russia, you left with a ticket that would get you all the way to Fresno. Part of it was on the train, getting up to the German ports, then the ship, and whether or not you had to go to England and change ships, which a lot of people did. Then you came to the United States or Canada. A handful ended up in Mexico, but you would come over here, then you took the train all the way across the country to your final destination, and that's what your ticket would say. Your original ticket from the very beginning would include all of that. So similar to what you might get from a travel agent. Well, a couple decades ago maybe. Today we get it all off of the internet. But that would have been what they did. Now, that first group was self-financed. My guess is all these people that came to Fresno would have been self-financed to get over here. Whether they were just attracted by the better opportunities. Now later, as things became more difficult in Russia, but also, Volga Germans are known for being frugal, shall we say? Okay, just this side of cheap sometimes, but frugal. And so the minute it became obvious that you were going to be leaving Russia, why would anybody pay you for anything? Because you were going to leave it all behind anyway, So the value of your stuff sort of, as more and more people left, you were able to get rid of less stuff for less money. And also there was a famine in 1891 as well, and you had a lot of scenarios there where people lost things. And so you had folks over here then paying your way to come over here. Now that was handled in a very similar way to what we would say today as Western Union, for example. The family here would wire that transaction to the place where the tickets were purchased, and you would come with a prepaid ticket to get here, that sort of thing. So I don't know, I haven't studied the banking side of that for whether or not how that worked exactly, but you think about it, Western Union's been around quite a while. You know, that type of being able to transfer funds for an international travel was what my ancestors did. I had groups that came in 1876, and the last members of my family came in 1922, in the middle of the famine, came over here. So the latter ones, of course, were funded by their relatives here in the States who had sent money, so to speak, over there and paid for their passage to come to the United States. But you had a ticket that had on the end of it, you know, Fresno, California, and that's where you were supposed to go. So some of the stories, there's a group of Volga Germans that settled outside of New York City, up in Orange County. Believe it or not, there's an Orange County, New York. Orange County, New York, has a whole group of folks from the colony of Yagodnaya Polyana. And they like to tell the story about where they got to the United States and got off the boat in New York and then got swindled out of their money, so they had to stay in New York. Not quite true. It turns out they were actually recruited by the onion farmers in Orange County, New York, to come and work in the onion fields of New York. So this is where the corner of New Jersey and New York are that drops down then into New York City. Orange County is at that corner of New York, and that's where you'll still today find lots of Volga Germans, all part of Dick Scheuermann's clan from Yagodnaya Polyana, the farthest north colony on the Bergseite, and they settled there. There's a whole group of that whole clan also in Maryland on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. So not all Volga Germans are in the western part of the United States. And those families we lost one person that I know in the Twin Towers on September the 11th, who was a Volga German who worked for Aon at the top of the second tower that went down. And he was a broker, lived in New Jersey in a Volga German neighborhood in part of Newark. Those people never came to the plains. They stayed in Newark, New Jersey. There are two settlements in Maryland. There's a group in New York. There are several groups in northern New York, closer to Rochester, that are very small, but there's still half a dozen Volga German families that went there and stayed there. So, and I was telling Jim this morning, we have Volga Germans in Alabama that went there to cut down trees. So, anyway, yes. I have no travel brochures. I've never seen them. The only thing I've seen are the newspaper things, the ads in the newspaper, the Volga German newspapers that were advertising, come to the United States and you get this much land and stuff. I mean, it was the standard sort of enticement to a farmer. One of the interesting things, if you weren't aware of this yet, the Volga German people did not own their farms. Okay, the farms were owned by the village, by the colony, and then every so many years they would redistribute the land among all the men in the colony. So this was not a socialist land. The land distribution was socialist, but the outcome wasn't. You got to keep whatever you grew on your piece of property. It's just that and it was a random sort of time, 10 years, 15 years, 18 years, 25 years, that they would redistribute all of this. You may end up with this little strip of land now, and then in 30 years you've got the strip of land that's over here. You get to keep everything you grow, but your land is held communally. So likewise, though, you didn't have that to sell. What you had to sell when you came to the States was your house and your village plot where you had your garden and your orchard and that sort of stuff. So there wasn't a farm to sell until after 1906. If you happen to have come after 1906, in some colonies, they implemented the new Russian system, which you could sell your property. Now that's different from the Black Sea Germans, okay, who owned their farms. Okay, in the Black Sea area, The 10 Mennonite villages that were on the Volga, also that land was communally held. And for the most part, those Mennonites did not come early. They were in a little protected area and ended up not having to serve in the military. But the Mennonites from southern Russia were the ones that first came over here in large numbers. So we actually have 10 Volga German Mennonite villages. Okay. So, yes.
I know it's been difficult politically. Will you be able to take tours back to Russia?
So, for those of you who don't know, I've led a number of tours to Russia. We've taken about 250 people over there so far. We have a number of them here. You want to raise your hands? People who went with me to Russia? Yay! We had a very good time. Right now, we had to cancel in 2020. We had 2 tours scheduled in 2020. They were canceled. We had 1 tour scheduled last year, this year, this August, had to be canceled, mostly because politicians are behaving badly. Not really because of the pandemic anymore, but right now the situation is such that I can take you to Russia, but I'm not so sure I can get you back here. And so that, because of the rules for pandemic-related stuff and things, the United States is not good friends with people coming from Russia, even if you happen to be an American coming back. So therefore, we canceled this year. The Russians very much want us to come. The hotels are open, the restaurants are open, the museums are open, the bus companies are running, the airlines are doing fine there. But right now, I can't guarantee that I can get you back. And if you got stuck there, then I probably would get stuck there, and I don't want to be stuck there. So anyway, we're still looking at it. You can look at the website, volgagermantours.com, and we have up the original itinerary from last year, from 2020, which included a new thing for those of you who had gone with me before. We've had so many requests to actually go out to Siberia to visit the colonies after the deportation that we added on 4 more days to go out to Omsk in Siberia, to go out there. And there's a German cultural district out there that's really cool. They have a lot of things going on German cultural-wise, but we're still hoping to go next year. We usually go in August. This is driven more by my colleague in Germany who goes as the Russian translator, and she works at a university near Heidelberg, and her schedule sort of governs when we can go. I'm a little more flexible. We try to go so that people who happen to be involved in the school systems can be back to be teaching and things. But anyway, that's why we usually go then. Although one year we went in May. You weren't in the May group, were you? May, June? You were in with the early ones. The year of the World Cup, that when it was held in Russia, we had to go early in the summer because the hotels were all booked up when we wanted to go there. So, all right, we're done. I'm over. I am so over. All right. I did not promise to sing a German lullaby to put you to sleep. But anyway, I appreciate your time. I thank you for putting up with having me come out here and interrupt your celebration. But congratulations to all of you for everything you accomplished here in Fresno. I can't say that enough. You guys do a great job. And you've got your historical group here that set the foundation, and it's up to the rest of you to keep it going.